In this video, I'm talking about non-monetary skin in the game, because monetary skin in the game has some problems with it. It's definitely not evenly distributed across the population. It tends to give too much power to people with money. And I do think if we're going to solve some of the problems we're trying to solve, especially in the online space, that we're going to need to broaden our perspective about what skin in the game actually means. And so we're going to be asking questions like, what does that even look like, non-monetary skin in the game? And we recognize that there's things like your reputation is something that you could stake in the same way you could stake money. Relationships. I'm not saying this is always good, but if you risk losing relationships in your life, that's definitely a form of skin in the game that is perhaps even higher and more important for most people than money. Your career prospects is something else that could matter in terms of your skin in the game. Because I do think economists have focused too narrowly on money for too long. And the field of behavioral economics is really opening up the window of things that we can look at when we're looking at what incentivizes people. So here's just an outline of where I'm going in this video. First, I'm going to explain a little bit about the contexts that I'm using to think through the skin in the game issue. Then I'll talk about the weaknesses of monetary skin in the game and how that's not going to be sufficient if we're trying to build online systems and online incentives that actually work. And then I'm going to look at some examples of non-monetary skin in the game, starting with examples that we actually already observe in the online world, and then thinking about what examples might we see in the future as people try to develop systems that use different kinds of skin in the game. And finally, I'd like to talk a little bit about some of the negative reactions people have when they hear about this, because there's some legitimacy, I think, to some of those negative reactions, and we just need a way of thinking through how might that play out, and what do we actually need to be afraid of when we're thinking about perhaps staking non-monetary things in our life. All right, so the first context I'd like to think about is smart contracts. And this video isn't about smart contracts, I have other videos on that, but basically smart contracts allow people to develop their own contracts that they can use to engage in different types of commerce with people without going through these big intermediaries. And part of the motivation here is that we're recognizing some of these huge monopolistic companies have too much power to set the rules and to take their cut of the pie. And one of the big things that those big monopolies do is that they enforce contracts between people. So the community that's thinking about smart contracts is really thinking about how could we actually negotiate our own contracts so that we don't have to give so much money and power to these big companies. And just as an example, one type of contract you might have would be you rent out your car, or Airbnb. You could rent out your home for a weekend in exchange for some money. And with those contracts, you need to be thinking about, how do I enforce good behavior? We don't want people to mess up the car. We don't want people to smoke in the car. We don't want people to trash our home in an Airbnb sort of situation. So how do you enforce both sides of that contract? And right now, smart contracts tend to rely on financial, and we know that big corporations have a lot of mechanisms for enforcing contracts. They hire lawyers, they can take people to court, they hire people to come after you if you don't follow through on a contract, maybe racking up fines and making constant phone calls. There's different mechanisms that the large corporations use to enforce contracts. At the moment, many of the smart contracts that have some sort of mechanism for enforcing these contracts involves staking money. So if you're going to rent the car, you might stake $200 that you get back if you return the car without having damaged it. Something like that. And of course, that is an example of financial skin in the game. Why don't you trash the car? Well, you know you'll lose your deposit if you do. But there's problems with financial skin in the game. And probably the biggest problem is the fact that a $200 deposit isn't that big of a deal for someone who's really rich, but it's a huge deal for someone who's really poor. This is because of diminishing marginal utility over money that economists have long studied, and you can validate in so many ways why diminishing marginal utility over money is a thing. So what this means is for lower income people to interact with these systems, they have to be very careful to follow the rules that the system is trying to enforce. But for high income people, since it's easy for them to just throw away a couple $100 and get rid of the deposit. That means that if they wanted to go in and mess with the system, not follow the rules, or do really whatever they want to, it's pretty easy for them to do that. And when we're trying to design these systems, we want to make sure that they're non-manipulatable. Because what we're trying to do is disrupt the world that benefits the rich, right? It's trying to disrupt the big tech monopolies. It's trying to disrupt the system that keeps the billionaires in our economy in power. And so, of course, if you're going along doing that, and you have this vulnerability to the very billionaires who don't want you to do that, that's going to stop the development of these blockchain-based systems. In which case, we need to be thinking about other forms of skin in the game that we could use besides money. And we especially need to be thinking about forms of skin in the game that are more evenly distributed across the population in terms of each person's stake. All right, so I'd like to go through some examples of non-monetary skin in the game, and I'm going to start with examples that we've already seen in the economy. The first one is reputation, and the example I'd like to give is eBay's reputation system. So before eBay was a thing, some people didn't think that was possible because they were like, how can you actually enforce someone actually sending you the product that you bought online? They're just going to post the product, take in the money, and not send it. And maybe they won't even have the product. Maybe it'll be a picture of something that they don't even own. So how did they get around that? They developed this reputation system for sellers so that people know if you're buying from someone who doesn't have a history of a good reputation, there's some risk there. And there's an incentive for the sellers, of course, to have good behavior because that preserves their reputation. And that reputation system, that version of skin in the game, was actually incredibly essential for eBay to succeed. So my second example here is the recommendations between colleagues for jobs. And yes, this relates to nepotism. It's not always a good thing. But why is it that employers are more likely to hire someone who knows someone in the company, where someone in the company vouches for their good behavior? Well, there's actually a number of reasons for this, but one of the reasons is that the person who recommended that potential employee, they have some relational skin in the game. If they recommend someone who's really not good or who's going to be an annoying colleague, then that's going to weaken their relationships with their coworkers. So when you recommend a friend for a job, you're really staking your relationship with other people in the company on that person being good. And that's information. The incentive system goes both ways. Now, this kind of thing is a problem for many different reasons. It sort of keeps power and influence within the same social circles, and that's one of the problems our society is facing right now. I'm not saying this is great, but I am describing the incentives where there's non-monetary relational incentives that get staked as a way of conveying accurate information. My third example here is staking your home when you sign mortgage documents, that if you don't follow through with that contract and pay your mortgage payments on time, they get your home. Now, this one's a little bit closer to financial skin in the game because a home is still an asset. It's just a less liquid asset. But the person's home is actually a little bit more than just money to them. It's sort of a place where they've made memories. It's a place where they've made the place their own space. So I think the home and the mortgage is not just a monetary asset to the person who's in the home. It's something more that has emotional attachment and attachment to neighbors and participation in a community, and all of those non-financial elements sort of bolster that as something you can stake when you sign your mortgage. Now, my fourth example here is going to be microloans, and a version of microloans that bases them on communities of people. So how do microloans work? It's somewhere in between a charity and a bank, basically, where charitable organizations / banks go into low-income countries where people need money, and they will make loans to people to start their small businesses, to stimulate the economy and communities that need to be lifted up. It's just generally a small loan that's given to someone in a community that's a little bit needier. That's kind of the idea. But of course, because these loans are to people who are in impoverished communities and communities that need to be lifted up economically, they're higher risk loans. There's a chance they won't pay them back, and that chance may be higher than the same dollar amount of loan in a rich community. So one thing they've done is, instead of making these loans to individuals, they let small groups of women come together as a little community, as a small group, to sort of hold each other accountable and to meet regularly about what they're doing with that money, how they plan to make the money back, to pay back the loan, etc., etc. And because it's based not only on the individual paying it back, but also on the reputation of the group of people, that creates these social and community-oriented incentives to pay the loan back. And of course, having these communities of women who meet regularly and sort of hold each other accountable, that does increase the payback rate of these loans. So similar systems could be used in a smart contract context. All right, so those are existing examples of non-monetary skin in the game. But what kinds of examples might we see moving forward? And the first one I'd like to talk about is just different forms of reputation scores. Now, when some people hear this, they're going to be thinking about the social credit score system in China at the moment, and a bunch of scary thoughts are going to come to their mind. And I'm going to address that in a minute. But first, I'd like to remind you that the eBay system was actually a reputation score. It was a social credit score of some sort, except instead of being owned by the government, it was owned by eBay, which is just a company that you can participate in or not participate in. And the fact that eBay didn't have full control over your lives meant that it's not a big deal. I'd also like to point out a weakness of eBay's reputation system, and that is that you can build up this reputation as a good seller, but it's only good on eBay because eBay owns that score for you. They know how they calculated it, they know who you are, they know your username is associated with your bank account so they can verify that. And it's actually really difficult for you to take that reputation score and use it to your advantage elsewhere. So eBay's ownership of that score keeps you on that platform. It gives them a lot of power. What if you actually owned your reputation score that you built up on eBay so that it was transferable to another company? And same with Amazon. I mean, there's a lot of reasons right now why we might be worried about Amazon's power. They just have a lot of monopoly power, and they're using it in ways that perhaps keep small businesses out. And other things, but that's not what this video is about. The point I'm trying to make here is that if you could transfer your reputation as a seller from eBay or Amazon onto a different startup, a new site that was competing with these companies, that would disempower the large tech monopolies. And it would empower the people who are working hard to develop their reputations so that they owned those reputations and could use them wherever they wanted. So part of the excitement about blockchain is that you can have reputation scores that are not locked to one company. They're owned by the people who actually put in the hard work, the labor, rather than the capital. So, sorry, I'm getting excited about this. There are so many ideas in this realm. I'm going to try to narrow it to what this video is about, which is non-monetary skin in the game. But the point I'm making here is that reputation systems of various sorts. This is reputation for following through on your word, for showing up, for anything. You can have lots of different types of reputation that you work hard to build up over time. And having that reputation be owned by the people rather than the government or rather than large companies could have some real advantages. Second, relationships. Now, this one I think is going to be more difficult to design in terms of skin in the game, where the skin in the game is relationships that matter to you. But it could be harnessed in ways that are powerful. And I mean, the microloan small group of women is an example of this. It's people that you spend a lot of time with, that you care how they think of you, you care your reputation as a group, not just your reputation as individuals, and that you want to hold each other accountable through sort of people looking you in the eye and saying, are you a woman of your word? That kind of stuff. This could be a very powerful mechanism for really building up capital that belongs to the people rather than to the companies. And being locked into a group of people that you care about through a team, that can actually be a very rewarding experience where we win and lose together, our reputations go up or down together, and we have an identity that's interlocked with each other. That's just a really powerful thing and meaningful thing as long as it isn't abused. And of course, that's the risk here, is that if you have relational skin in the game, could that be abused? Yeah, it could be. Could it increase the chances that a friend takes advantage of you in some ways? Yeah, it could. Could it make it more difficult to set good boundaries with friends, or could it necessitate the need for more boundaries with friends? Yeah, I think it could. And as we develop new systems of accountability, new mechanisms to sort of disempower the large tech monopolies, empower the workers, I think we're going to have to sort through a lot of that stuff. But one of the advantages of relationships is the fact that it's way more evenly distributed. Because no matter how rich you are, you only have a certain amount of time, you only have a certain number of relationships that you can truly invest a lot of yourself in. So there is the potential to reduce the kind of inequality and also potentially empower poorer communities, because oftentimes poorer communities have really strong bonds, really strong church relationships, really strong communities, because they have to rely on those relationships in a way that rich people don't necessarily have to. So I'm really just laying out possibilities of ways that we could have non-monetary incentives built into the system. And I'm acknowledging that these kinds of things, reputation and relationships, matter more to a lot of people than money. Finally, I'd like to respond to the negative reaction people have when they think about the credit score and the idea of social credit scores of various types. And the first thing to note here is that all technologies can be used for good or for evil. This is something I constantly remind my audience of, because I'm talking about the development of new technologies when I talk about blockchain and different systems like this. And also, the second thing to keep in mind is that almost all technologies are going to have bugs and problems when they're first introduced into the world. And part of the first few years that a new technology is out there is working through those kinks. And if we're talking about staking our relationships and staking our reputation, those are actually some scary kinks to work through. Like, who's going to be the guinea pigs for systems like this? I don't have answers, I'm just laying out the questions. The second thing here is that the power of the person designing the system or group designing the system matters a lot. So if it's the government issuing these social credit scores, are they going to mix real things that matter to people, like whether you follow through on promises and whether you show up? Are they going to mix that with manipulative things like whether you criticize the government? And I'll let you answer that question for yourself, but really any sort of system that's designing a reputation score of any kind can mix in their own motives along with things that people really do care about as a way of sort of channeling the population. And this is why I think transparency, which blockchain helps with, and other factors are going to be really important, because otherwise it empowers the big parties too much. And the big parties could be the government or could be large corporations. So in thinking through these in the future, we're going to be needing to think through how power dynamics play out with different kinds of non-monetary skin in the game. All right, and now I'm just thinking through other issues with this off the top of my head. But there's also the issue that any institution, and when I'm talking about a credit score, certainly, that is a form of institution. Any institution can become corrupt over time. As a matter of fact, that tends to happen. An institution sort of builds up credit as being really good over time. It gets a great reputation for itself, and that's through a lot of hard work, a lot of interacting with people, being just to people. It takes a long time to develop a really solid reputation. And there's an incentive for bad actors to hijack institutions that have a good reputation and use them for their own causes. Because the reputation of a system depreciates perhaps slowly. If your grandmother says, trust this institution, you tend to believe her, even if that institution has perhaps become more corrupt than it was in her day. So this is just another factor to think through when we're considering non-monetary skin in the game. Alright, I think I've rambled enough for this video. This has been really fun for me to think through. I hope you had as much fun as I did, and I'm sure this is not the last time I will be talking about issues like this.